just jumped in by themselves. All right, so welcome to our July seminar, Stat Central. Our presenter, before we go straight to it, if you haven't been involved with Stat Central before, we are a group of statistical consultants who offer free design advice to all UNSW researchers and free design and analysis advice to HDR students. And you can request those services on our website. We also do statistical review of your grant or ethics proposals. We do short courses. We give seminars, which is what you're here for today. We do partnerships where, you know, one of our consultants can spend a day a week for a long period of time at your lab or unit, and we do kind of single contracts to work on big analysis jobs. So if you want any more details about those things, you can go to our website and you can sign up to the Stat Central mailing list to hear about our seminars and courses and events and things. So with no further ado, I'll introduce our speaker for this month. Nancy Briggs is one of the senior consultants and our manager at Stat Central, and she's going to be talking today about survey and questionnaire design and giving you some practical advice for researchers. And if you've got questions, you can post them in the chat or wait until the end and, you know, raise your hand or something, and Nancy will answer them. Over to you, Nancy.
Okay, there we go. Can you see my screen? Look good? Okay. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the Briggs people that are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. Today I'm going to be talking about things that you can do when you're creating a data collection instrument, a survey or questionnaire, that can ensure that at the end of your study, you're actually able to answer the research question, the research focus that motivated your study in the first place. I am not going to be going over statistics hardly at all in this talk. But we thought it was important to do something like this because we often are presented with data or have questions or consultations with people who have collected data from surveys or questionnaires, and were unfortunately able to answer the exact question that they wanted to because the format of the data collection doesn't allow us to do an ideal analysis. So we have a few things to say about the creation of these instruments that will help you later on when data analysis and writing up the results, when those things happen. So hopefully some of these tips and recommendations will help you at the very beginning of your research study, to ensure that at the end you're able to do what you actually wanted to do. Surveys in research are really popular because they're relatively easy to gather lots of data quickly. Recently online tools have made it really easy to create surveys. So you can use Google to Google Forms to create a survey. We have at UNSW, all of us have access to Qualtrics, which is a quite sophisticated questionnaire and data gathering service. My slides aren't full screen. I don't know what that means. Okay, so about that. Somebody's telling me, are you just seeing my PowerPoint rather than my, okay, hold on, let me.
So, casual academics.
Try this. Let me try sharing again. There we go. Is that better? That's better. Okay. Let me go back. I need to go back. Come on. Now, of course, my previous, there we go. Online tools make it really easy to create those surveys, but it also sort of removes a lot of the human error when you're doing data entry, because the data is collected for you at the point of entry. It helps you avoid those data entry errors. So online tools are a really attractive way to get your data. And it enables the researcher to use a variety of question formats to gather their information. And also, when you have surveys that are online or paper-based, sometimes they allow a respondent a little bit of distance from very sensitive topics that they may be reluctant to talk about in person. So sometimes you can get some information more quickly on those sensitive topics through these online or paper-based surveys than you would be if you were to do in-person methods. But a good survey is not easy to create, even though we have some good methods in which to create them. Making them good is not easy, nor is it necessarily quick. And good depends on your specific research goal and your mode of administration. Some recommendations are going to be different if you are doing a telephone administered survey versus an online survey. So it really depends on a few different things what a good survey actually is. And things to keep in mind is that people who agree to respond to a survey are rarely a random sample from the larger population. There are differences between people who refuse to answer survey questions and those who are willing to give their time to it. So that's something to keep in mind. And you're very rarely going to be able to get a random sample unless you are the ABS. Even then, they have some trouble doing that. And responses are usually subjective. Usually when you're gathering data with these methods, you are not getting objective data. You can often link your survey data to objective databases if you have consent and have access to those. But responses in these types of surveys are usually subjective, and that means there's a lot of room for interpretation and ways of responding. Because people are humans, and humans do some really strange things or things that you may interpret as strange. And there is an entire field of research, judgment decision making, that's focused on how people make decisions and how they respond to questions and situations and uncertainty. And all of these things can combine to lead to bias in responses. So, but the good thing is, there is a lot of research on how to reduce that bias. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those techniques today. So designing a good survey starts with always knowing what you are going to study. Just as with any research project, your clear goals are really important for a good result. A survey or questionnaire asking people, for example, about vaccine hesitancy, which is something that's quite topical at the moment, will look very different depending on the goal of the survey. And so, for example, say you have 3 researchers who are all interested in surveying people about vaccine hesitancy, and they're all going to create a questionnaire or a survey. But the way that in which they're phrasing their research goal, their research question, has big impacts on the types of items or questions they ask of their respondents. So our first person says she wants to know why people are hesitant to get the COVID vaccination. She's going to make a survey. Our second person wants to identify factors that are associated with intention to obtain a COVID vaccination, particularly sociocultural or religious influences that contribute to vaccine hesitancy. And she's going to do this by making a survey. And finally, our last person is going to rely on previously research scales, the health risk attitude scale, and she's going to create some items that are very similar to the items in that scale, but really aimed at assessing vaccine hesitancy. So all of these people are asking a question about vaccine hesitancy, but the way their research goals are really quite different. So a good survey is really going to look quite different for each of these people. So for the first person, where she's just looking at why people may be hesitant to get COVID vaccination, this might be a really good start in a topic in which there is very little information already available, or if the people that the person wants to are an under-researched population. This might suggest that open-ended questions, so questions where people are allowed to talk a lot, are appropriate. But if you are actually interested in, say, creating that scale based on the health risk scale, this stating your research goal as why people are hesitant to get the COVID vaccination and keeping that primary in your mind, that's going to lead you to not being able to create a very good vaccine hesitancy scale. So you want to be really secure in your purpose, and that's going to help guide you in the types of questions that you'll present to your respondents. This second person who wants to look at the socio-contextual influences might focus on specific questions about how public health institutions or religious beliefs and practices affect vaccine hesitancy. And she could likely have some ideas about the relationships between those factors and vaccine hesitancy behaviors. And so she may be thinking that she would model these relationships using some sort of linear model in order to talk about those influences. That means she can be very deliberate in her study, not only in creating her survey, but also planning her sample size, how many people she would like to talk to, and the types of analyses that she's going to do at the end. And finally, this third researcher, she's already given herself a lot of structure by saying she's going to adapt the health risk assessment scale or attitude scale to assess vaccine hesitancy. She's likely going to create items that are very similar in structure to the items in this scale. And she's probably going to follow data analysis recommendations and strategies for assessing reliability and validity. So what are some general steps to creating a good survey or questionnaire? Even though we have some tools that might make it easy to get up and running very quickly, if you're going to be very careful, it's not necessarily a very quick process, or it might take longer than you would expect. So first of all, like I said, you always need to know what you are going to study and make sure that you're always focusing on that. Then you can create your items and questions, but don't waste your time quite yet. If you are doing an online survey, creating those items in the online survey, don't do it yet. Just create a document in which you're writing down the questions that you would like to create, and then you need to leave it. Just like if you're writing a manuscript, writing out the results for something, it's always good to give yourself lots of time away after you've done a lot of work on it to come back and look at it again. Same thing here. You may come back and realize that you're sort of getting off track, or you missed a whole sort of section or a concept that you need to address. And when you come back, then you can review your items and have other people, maybe in your research team, review the items as well. And after that review and revising has happened, then maybe you can make your actual instrument. So it could be paper-based or those online services. If you're doing a telephone-based one, you can start setting up the guide that the interviewers will follow. Then once you've gotten that done, you obviously want to test it. And that means creating a few fake test records. And so that you are providing an answer or not for all of your questions, and then exporting that data to make sure that the data looks as it should and all of your data are actually exported. That's a really important thing because you don't want to run into problems after you've collected a whole bunch of data and realize you can't actually access the data. So that is really important to test that data export and looking at how it looks in your stats analysis program. And then give yourself another break and then send it out to other people who haven't taken a look at the items previously and have them respond to the survey and give you opinions. And another thing to always keep in mind is that respondents are human and they do human things. And so when you are refining your survey, realize that people who have never seen these items before may interpret your words differently. And hopefully in your testing with some friends and colleagues, you might catch some of the vagueness of wording. And you might be able to see that if people are responding weirdly, or you see some weird patterns in that test data. And I don't use the word weirdly as in a judgmental sense. I mean it in a way that it's not as you as the researcher expect. You have a complete idea of what that particular item is trying to get at, but to somebody else, it may not be so clear. And so they're interpreting what you're asking quite differently from what you intended. And you might interpret their responses weird, but they're answering as they think they should be. Okay, so I'm going to move on to some descriptions of very common item types, question types in your survey. There are a lot of different ways to gather data. But I'm only going to go over the most common item question types that you will probably use, but that is not this is not a definitive list in any form. But I'm going to be focusing on free text, categorical, continuous type responses, and Likert type of items. But you have lots of different options, such as asking people to rank options. That's a popular one. Asking people to name their best and worst options from a big list. Choosing all that apply. If you have a whole big list as well. Maybe sometimes you would be presenting people with a pairwise choice. So of these two options, which would you prefer? And these, most of these have particular data analysis strategies that go along with them that are not standard. And so if you are going to be using any of these down here, almost all of them require you to do lots of learning about how to treat those data properly once you get everything. So just to let you know, if you are going to be doing any of those, you need to think carefully about how you will analyze the data at the end, but you do it, you think about that way before you ever collect your data. Okay, so free text questions. These are open-ended questions. And these would be really good for that first researcher who wants to just look at why people might feel a bit of hesitancy about vaccines. And these are great for qualitative research because it gives lots of rich textual data. And for quantitative researchers, we may be able to find themes in those answers, and we can use those themes as a basis for further research, either qualitative or quantitative. If you are a person who's looking for some qualitative help, Stat Central is not your best option. None of us are really qualitative researchers, but there are qualitative researchers from the university who you might be able to consult with, but that's not our focus. And you may be able to take these text answers and do some descriptive statistics. You might be able to sort of code the answers for common themes. But the thing is, you aren't guaranteed to obtain many overlapping ideas across your sample with these open-ended questions. And you can see here some of these questions over here. They tend to be questions that are how or what or why, that allow people to express their thoughts. And this might be a good time to think about your mode of administration as well. These types of things might be really great for verbal data gathering, because it allows people to talk, and people are probably more fluent than typing things out for answering these types of things. So this might be really good for a telephone or in-person interview. Some things to help you do make some good questions. You need to avoid biased language that leads a person to a particular response. So you wouldn't want to say something like, what do you consider to be the causes of vaccine hesitancy? For example, distrust of government. And what do you know? You're going to get a lot of people going, oh yeah, government, I don't trust them at all. If you phrase your question something like that. So you need to be very careful to avoid biased language in free text or in other types of items as well. Avoid ambiguous questions. Something like, how do you feel about vaccines? It's a valid question, but it's going to be interpreted quite differently by everyone in your sample. And so you may not be able to find some very common themes in a question that's a bit vague. And finally, make sure that you're not presenting too many ideas at once, asking too many things at a time. Make sure that you split that up if you find a particularly complex question. Categorical questions. These are items that offer a selection of responses and people choose one or more. And these can be nominal categories. So something like, hey, do you currently smoke more than 10 cigarettes per week? And your responses might be yes or no. And so you have sort of nominal categories as a response, or they could be ordinal. And perhaps you're asking people about their income, and you don't want them to have to give you an actual number, so you present them with ordered ranges, income ranges, and they choose the one that contains their annual income. There are lots and lots of formats for these types of items, so choose carefully. And this is going to rely on your research question and being kind to your respondents. As I've mentioned, those are always things to keep in mind, what your research focus is, and not asking too much of your respondents. So here's one way that you could present some categorical items to people. I have a few statements, and I'm asking people to read them and indicate by clicking on a box if it applies. And so it's relatively easy. You don't have to move the cursor too much, or move your hand too much if you're presenting it on paper. But the thing here is that your data is likely to be recorded as an indicator of whether an option was selected. And that means that you're unable to distinguish whether a blank checkbox is a no, or somebody's like, I'm not answering that question. So you're conflating a no response with a non-response. And in general, that's probably not the best thing. Because you might have some specific questions that you need to know how many people actually answered that question for. Yeah, so just because you have 50% answering yes to that question, you don't know how many people were skipping any one of these options versus no, 50% actually not thinking that's an important statement or doesn't apply to them. Alternatively, you could ask those 3 questions as separate questions and provide those 2 responses, yes or no, for each of them. And that way you are avoiding that conflation of a no response and a no. But if you have too many of these types of questions, I think that you're running into you're being less kind to your respondents than you would like. But first of all, it gets to be kind of hard to continually find the right button to push, and they're all spread out across the page, and it's a lot on your screen all at once, and it just doesn't make it very easy. And it can lead to responder fatigue and frustration. And you want to minimize that as much as possible, because this fatigue and frustration is going to lead to people going, you know what, I'm not answering anymore, or doing I'm just pushing yes for every single answer. So you want to limit that type of taxing interaction between your respondent and your survey. This may be a better way to avoid both of those issues. We have the same 3 items, and we're making it really easy to know which box is a yes and which box is a no. And then we have this other extra thing, no response, or sometimes it will be noted as not applicable, something like that. So each of these distinguishes between somebody who says, no, this is not true of me, versus this is, I'm skipping responding, or this is not applicable to my situation at all. So it completely takes away the conflation of those 2 responses. And it's very easy for somebody to quickly go through each thing and know exactly which box to check. Continuous items. These are items that are meant to elicit a number from people. So something like, what is your age? You'll get people saying, I'm 24, I'm 62, I'm 50. They'll tend to tell you the number in years of what they are. So you're going to get well, depending on your sample, but you would expect to see lots of different values in this answer. So you could consider this a continuous variable. You might also have an item, so something like, on a scale of 0 to 100, how likely are you to obtain a vaccination within the next 4 weeks? So you're trying to sort of get at what's the probability of them going to get their vaccination in the next month. Now, the thing about that type of question is that if you're measuring attitudes, beliefs, opinions, it's actually hard to measure using a continuous item. First of all, people are really different, are going to interpret a 0 to 100 scale, except for those very end, endpoints. They're going to be quite a variable in their response, their quantitative response to that 0 to 10 scale. You will also find that people will say 50%, 75%. You'll get a lot of people saying those answers. You're going to get very few people saying 60%, even fewer people saying 62%. And in fact, if you get somebody who says 48.3%, you're probably going to look at that answer and go, are they actually giving me a good estimate, or are they being observant? So even though the item itself is, strictly speaking, on a continuous scale, you're not going to get a continuous response. And if you were to get continuous responses, it might lead you as the researcher to think that this person is not really considering their response very carefully, which that's not a situation you want to get in. So if you do have continuous items, make sure that people are likely to respond to them in a continuous way, or you are hampering yourself quite a bit when you actually go to analyze your data. Finally, we have Likert type items. And I will say that, yes, it is pronounced Likert, but I think I've already said during this presentation Likert a few times, because that is so ingrained in my head. But as I was writing this up, I went and looked it up, and it is Likert. So just to let you know, all of you have seen these before. They are very, very, very common and pretty useful. But you still have to think very carefully about these items. It's common response to measure sort of the magnitude of agreement or disagreement with a particular statement. And it might look something like this. COVID vaccine is important for my health. And you have 5 different categories, ranging ordinally from strongly disagree all the way up to strongly agree. And you can have present a bunch of statements like this, and it's very visually okay and not too taxing for the person. So that's really great. But you need to consider a number of things. First of all, you should consider the number of categories. There is no particular number of categories that is absolutely the best. So there are some advantages or disadvantages to the number of categories that you present to people. You can also decide whether or not the inclusion of a middle neutral category is a good idea or not, based on some advantages or disadvantages of either choice. And then also, once you've gotten the data from a Likert scale, then you have to decide, is it a continuous or ordinal categorical type data? And that has big implications for the types of data analysis that you could do at the end. Okay, so first, number of categories. It's really common to see 5 or 7 point scales, but you can see that in this table here, presents Likert type scales from 2 points, disagree versus agree, all the way up to 11 points on a scale. But most often you see 5 or 7, sometimes 6. And so how do you choose how many different options you present to someone? Well, first of all, mode of administration is a big consideration. If you are doing an in-person or phone administered survey, can you imagine the person who is administering the survey reading out for every item the 11 different category titles and say, okay, which one do you choose for the in response to the item? Well, first of all, a person's not even going to remember what the item is after all the responses are listed. So obviously, if you're doing something where it's in person or by phone, you're going to need to restrict the number of response categories that are available for the person, because they just don't cognitively have, anybody really doesn't have the cognitive capacity to keep the item, the question itself, and the response scale in their head, and then also provide an answer to you. Also, even if you are doing online or paper-based administration, those scales with 11 or 10 points, is there really much difference between slightly disagree, mostly disagree, and disagree? Is there that much of a fine-grained difference between those? I don't know, maybe for you there is. For me, they're all pretty much the same. And so I would probably randomly choose one of those 3, and same thing for the corresponding agree side. In which case, your data actually, more options sort of muddies things a bit, and you're probably going to end up having sort of lower correlations just because people have a hard time distinguishing between those options. So having more options may hamper you as well. Okay, so other things that you can use to help decide the number of categories you present for these items. Well, first of all, researchers disagree themselves on what's best. You can find lots of different studies talking about what's the optimal number of categories, and there isn't one that is best, but usually 5 to 7 options is recommended because they allow good variability, and for statistics that help you assess the reliability and validity of your scale, that variability is needed. If you restricted the variability, it's much harder to demonstrate the statistical properties and psychometric properties of your scale. So between 5 and 7 seems to do okay. One of the things that you should do as you're testing your items is look at response distributions for your Likert scales. And if you are seeing that you have a highly skewed distribution, if you've only got 5 options, it may be that there's not enough room for people who agree, like this in this plot on the left, to sort of differentiate people who really strongly agree versus, moderately agree or something. So if you increase the number of response categories, that might spread out a little bit, and you can end up with slightly less skewed data, which helps when you're doing your analysis later on. Now we can move on to the inclusion of a middle option. So I presented a 5-option Likert scale, and it's usually presented something along these lines. You've got strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, or strongly agree. Sometimes this neutral option is stated as neither agree or disagree. The thing about this middle option is that people interpret it, and this is shown in research, in really different ways. So it's often used as, oh, I actually don't have an opinion. I'm undecided because there are good things and bad things, or I equally agree and disagree. And those are also different ideas and interpretations of that middle category. So if you're allowing a middle category, people who endorse that might be sort of muddying your data a little bit. There are some advantages to allowing that middle category. It allows respondents an out, and this is especially good for sensitive or emotionally latent topics, where people might have a hard time stating clear agreement or disagreement. It allows them still to answer a question. But it allows respondents an out. And it may be sort of an easy thing so that they don't actually have to think very much about how they actually feel or agree or disagree with a particular topic. And it allows people to be less discriminating and not take the time to really think about an item and their answer to it. If you were to remove it, so here now we have a 6-option Likert scale. You've now turned it into a forced choice question. And there are advantages to it. You're forcing people to be on a side here. And it may actually provoke more thoughtful consideration of the question. And then you avoid that situation where you have varied interpretations of that middle option. But because you've forced a choice, you can end up causing a bit of frustration for your respondent. If you do that too often, or it's a particularly sensitive thing where they're not able to sort of opt out without that middle option, they could end up going, you know what, I'm not answering anymore. That's it, I'm done. Okay, so for the inclusion of a middle option, what to do? Well, once again, there's no definitive answer, but you should consider what are you researching, and whether or not allowing people that neutral option, which may be somewhat hard to interpret, is a good thing in order to decrease frustration. You also have the option of adding another response option. So completely opting out of answering the question at all. So rather than providing a response on that Likert scale, also providing one final option where it's prefer not to answer, or I'm not going to answer, a non-response type thing. So it allows that non-response and takes out that sort of muddying the interpretation of that middle option. I'm not saying that is recommended. I'm saying it is a decision you could make. Finally, what kind of data is a Likert response? If you code a response as numeric 1 to 7 and you get a good variability in responses, can you consider it numeric? Obviously, somebody who answers strongly agree agrees more with somebody with the statement than somebody who's neutral or one of the disagree options. So in one sense, the numbers that go along with those categories make sense. And if you say, yes, they're numeric, then you can report on means and standard deviations, and you might be able to use linear regression with the item response as outcome. It's easy for you to do and easy for people to understand what you did, and that's great. But you need to consider whether a difference between category 1 and 3, so for the 7-point scale, strongly disagree and slightly disagree. Is that difference the same as the difference between 4 and 6, which is neither agree nor disagree and agree? Is that distance actually the same? I will tell you, no, it's probably not, and it actually differs for everyone, and probably differs for items as well. And there is a lot of research in psychology on psychological scaling. If you are interested in how statistically researchers have dealt with this, but the overriding message is it's very unlikely that a 2-category difference is consistent even within a person. Maybe it's not actually numeric. So is it ordinal? Well, yes, it is absolutely ordinal. It's just that differences between the numbered categories aren't consistent, but it also leads to you having to do analyses that are slightly more complex and less easy to explain and understand. It requires a bit more of you and a bit more careful interpretation for when you're actually talking about your results. Okay, now finally, I want to emphasize again how people are human, humans are vastly complex and different amongst each other. If you aren't careful in your survey design, you will end up with frustrated respondents and your data will not be great. If you frustrate everyone by the time they get to the end, you might not have any useful data at all. They may stop answering. They may just click yes for every response. They might get frustrated, and if you allow them any free text, other type of questions, they may let you know how frustrated they are in that. As long as you keep this in mind when you are designing your instrument, you can make sure that you design something that minimizes the frustration factor from the very beginning. But I want to say that when people give weird responses, it's not often, and a lot of times, most of the time, it's not even deliberate. And once again, I'm saying weirdly, but it's only weird in it's against your expectations as a researcher. So, for example, you have people who differ in their sort of enthusiasm, and I look at myself versus my mom. My mom is a person who is very extreme in her opinions, and everything is really awesome or really, really terrible. Whereas I'm things are pretty okay. Yeah, I guess I could do better. And so we have really different ways of naming our more extreme opinions. And that's not actually weird in terms of human responses. But it does have implications for how people respond in these surveys, and something that you should be aware of when you are looking at your data. People also often respond in ways that reduce work or cognitive load for them. And I mentioned an example on that, probability, the likelihood of getting a vaccine in 4 weeks. Where people will say 50% or 75%. That response isn't a flippant response. It is a decent summary, numeric response of their, I don't know, maybe yes, maybe no, or probably yes. rather than a mathematical calculation, because they're just not going to do that. It's not efficient. But a summary thing like 50%, 75%, or 95% is a valid expression of their probability that is not too cognitively intense for them. Finally, there are a lot of ways of wording or presentation of items that can affect how people respond. And this is something that's well researched again in that judgment decision-making literature. How you frame a question. Usually it's a positive or a gain frame versus a loss frame or a negative frame, and that can affect how people tend to respond. And so that is on you. So you need to make sure that the items that you are presenting to them are not framed in a way that sort of demands that they more likely answer in one way versus another. More general tips, once again, be kind to your respondents. So always thinking about that, but you can this is something that you should be returning to as you revise your survey. In particular, total time. You don't want a survey to take a lot of time because people will get tired and may not be as careful toward the end as they are at the beginning. Take into account your mode of administration. An in-person survey may be really great to get lots of rich information, but you may need to limit the number of questions because the total time to get through all of them might be quite long. You can also look at your preliminary data just to look at your distributions, so that if you need to make any changes or you're finding very strange distributions on your response frequencies, you can do it and then still also have a good number of people responding to that edited question. Hopefully you'll be able to do that very quickly once you start gathering data, so that you don't have to exclude 50% of your sample because you hadn't looked at your data and realized that nobody was answering anything but completely agree to most of your Likert type scale items. Here are a few references for you to give you suggestions for writing questions. The ABS obviously has lots of experience doing this, so there are a few references on here. And these are some references on Likert scales and framing effects and position effects for particular types of questions in your survey, and how those factors can affect how people respond. And in particular, I wanted to point out that you need to even be very careful about how you ask questions on sex, gender, and gender identity. Thinking very carefully about what you actually want to know from those types of questions, and also questions regarding Indigenous status. And the ABS and UNSW have recommendations on how to include things like that in your survey. So take a look at those. I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Nancy. Covered a lot of ground there. Hopefully people found it interesting.
Yeah, I should have said that as I was going through this, I realized I could probably do a whole series on survey design because I didn't even get past item creation here. So that's why you can have whole courses on it.
Yep, yeah, definitely. So we've got probably about 5 minutes for questions. There's a few in the chat already.
Okay.
One of them I think you've answered on your slide. So someone asked, could you provide a paper or reference for the point about framing, I think it was. So this is probably just a good time to mention that these slides will be up on the Stats Central website. And if you just find the seminars page, I guess in the next day or two, along with a recording of this session. So the next question is it required for questions to be related to certain domains that a researcher wanted to explore?
Well, if I'm wondering if this question is it okay to include questions that aren't specifically aimed at your specific research goal? Yes, but you can include other questions that maybe you don't have particular analysis ideas or research questions to go along with. But keeping in mind that you should be kind to your respondents. Because if you just throw in a bunch, they're going to get more frustrated or tired much more quickly.
All right, the next one from Christopher. How about using validated survey instruments to reduce bias and enable comparisons with other studies?
Absolutely, that's absolutely. If you are able to use a validated instrument, you can. The thing about that is, if it is a proprietary instrument, they will obviously you'll have to pay. But also they may require you to present items a particular way. So you need to make sure that you are following all of their recommendations. But if it isn't a proprietary thing and it's a published study, they probably have, if it's a well-researched scale, they probably have those recommendations available to you anyway. And you should try not to change the items too much. If you're doing something like that third researcher that I mentioned, likely what she'll do is create items that are very similar to that health risk assessment scale. And so if you are trying to add on another sort of dimension like she is, you try to keep the method as close as possible. But you can also just say, hey, I'm going to use the health risk assessment scale as part of my survey.
Okay, there's one question which I think you did touch on. Any advice on having an odd or even number of responses in a Likert scale? Does an odd number allow people to sit on the fence?
Yeah, yes, it does.
Yep.
It does allow people to sit on the fence. And having that middle section allows those people, and also people who genuinely have no opinion. So you're getting a mixture of people who would choose that middle thing. And you have to decide, is that okay with you? It may be okay, given you maybe are in a particularly sensitive topic, and you don't want people to get too upset by forcing them to agree or disagree. So for that reason alone, you're being kind and reducing frustration. So it really depends on what your goal is and what the topic is.
Okay, and a couple of similar questions. What do you think the maximum length is, and what do you think is the ideal length of a survey?
Yeah, I didn't say that, did I? Because you really have to think about the people you're going to be asking questions of. If you're going to be asking questions of, say, parents of chronically ill children, if they're spending a lot of time in the hospital, they're really stressed out, they are unlikely to want to respond to a very long questionnaire. But if you are gathering data on a topic that is, more fun and less taxing, and your sample are college students or something like that, maybe they're going to be more willing to spend 30 minutes answering these questions. So it really depends on what you are researching and the likelihood of a person to have the patience to help you.
Okay, and maybe we'll just do one more question. There's a few more that you might want to stick around and answer in the chat, Nancy, if you've got time. But I think this is an important one, which probably doesn't have a quick answer, but it might be important to touch on. Do we have any standard equation in getting a number of respondents in a huge population?
Yeah, it depends on the type of response that that you are presenting to people, what your major research question is and how you're measuring it, and what you expect to see or what you'd like to be able to say with what confidence. And that is a sample size calculation question. And that is something that we deal with almost every day. So if you're having trouble coming up with a justification for a sample size for a questionnaire or survey that you're doing, come to us and we can help you.
Great. All right. So I think apologies to the people who had also put questions in the chat that we didn't get to, but we might end the seminar now. Thanks a lot, everyone, for coming. And as I mentioned before, if you want to get these slides or rewatch the recording of this, they will appear on the Stat Central website in the next couple of days. So yeah, thanks a lot, Nancy, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.